essential ceremonial tradition and a way of giving homage to the ancestors. A prayer is offered calling the ancestors to attend, and a libation of water or liquor is offered to them. The choice of liquid depends on the nature of the libation and prayer and what you aim in invoking or awakening the ancestors. After doing these things, we close with Ashe, which means let it be done.
Our ancestors voyaged through death to life on these shores. We are here because of them. Mojuba, I give praise to Olodumare, the queen whose mat spreads across the universe.
Can you hear it, Rashida?
Yes, Winston, we can hear it.
Our ancestors voyaged through death to life on these shores. We are here because of them. Mojuba, I give praise to Olodumare, the queen whose mat spreads across the universe. I give praise to the sunset and the sunrise. I give praise to the Egun, the ancestors, both known and unknown. I give praise to the Orisha, the manifestations of Olodumare, the supreme being, who are made manifest in the natural order and the natural world, and who are found within each and every human being. King Kamashe, let no negativity befall those of you who are watching this broadcast. May there be no fighting in your families. May there be no death in your families in this time of COVID-19. May there be no sickness in your families. Grant us long life. Grant us overall health and peace. Ashe, Ashe, Asheo, Ashe, Yoruba word meaning, may it be so.
For over 400 years, more than 35 billion men, women, and children, victims of the tragic transatlantic slave trade, one of the most catastrophic chapters in human history. This tragedy also included the British overseas territories of which Bermuda is one. In this presentation, you will learn about the early African Bermuda enslavement history,
the past and all of the wisdom to be found therein. As a result, they left the wisdom of many thousands of years, and they collapsed this wisdom into, in West Africa at least, what is known as a Adinkra iconography, one of which was the backward-looking bird with an egg in its mouth, symbolizing, go back and fetch it. Now, what does that mean for us? Well, we look back into it, study our history with a view to mining the wisdom to be found therein and bringing that wisdom with us so that we can birth a future that is triumphant, that allows us to develop the spiritual, moral, intellectual wherewithal to triumph over adversity and oppressors here in the here and now. We have gone back, fetched the information, brought it to the present day, armed ourselves accordingly, and triumphed over our enemies, right? So again, the egg symbolizing a future pregnant with promise. Sankofa, go back and fetch it.
Okay, great. Thank you, Jala. That was an awesome meaning, explanation of it.
Why you pay me the big bucks?
Yeah, that was awesome, awesome. Okay, so Gina, just before we get to Sarah Sally Bassett, of course, we'd like to hear from you to provide a background of what was going on then. And can you share with us the conspiracies that have been researched?
Yes, and as we look back, it's so important. I like the fact that we're starting right here with the poison plots, especially when we're talking about Sarah Bassett, Sarah Bassett, because from 1720 to 1730, during that time period when she was really, really relevant and the things occurred with her, that was known as the poisoning plots, because there were a lot of poisoning plots in Bermuda involving the black men and women against the enslavers. Black people were extremely knowledgeable about plants and herbs, and they understood not just the healing potential of these herbs, but also they had a really firm grasp on the poisoning potential. And obeah was practiced by the enslaved people in Bermuda. And they understood how powerful that message was. They understood it, like it was a greater part of them. And they connected with it in so many ways. And one of the ways in which they connected with it that was feared by the enslavers was the botanical chemistry, the ability to take plants and herbs and heal or kill. And what the enslavers were afraid of was their ability to kill them. They were so skilled and so well informed that they actually taught others about the art of poisoning, and whenever the services were needed, they were there. And the enslavers believed that these plots were aimed at them, and rightly so they were, because it wasn't benign. If it was benign, as Ajala used to say all the time, if it was benign, they wouldn't try to kill them, all right? So fearful of the food they ate, that whenever a plate of food was prepared and put before them, they made one of the enslaved persons taste it first before they put a sample of food into their mouth, because they wouldn't let a morsel touch their own lips to ensure that it wasn't poisoned. Not that it made a difference, because they were so skilled at this sort of stuff that these families died suddenly and mysteriously, and a lot of it was a result of these successful poisoning plots. Then this was made clear. And this, I should say, these reports, and we know this because there were reports that were made to Whitehall, and that stated that the enslaved people have destroyed many of His Majesty's subjects by poison, and many more are now lingering under that misfortune, whose lives are despaired of. Because of these mysterious deaths, the government was quick to act. All enslaved persons suspected of being poisonous were rounded up, locked up, put on trial, and 9 times out of 10 they were killed. The act entitled "For the Further and Better Regulating Negroes and Other Slaves, and for the More Effectual and Speedy Way of Prosecuting Them in Criminal Causes" was used swiftly to bring them to trial. Having said that, let's take a moment to watch a short clip on what is voodoo. For it has minor similarities as obeah, in a sense that they both resort to the ancestral spirit realms to communicate with ancestors and spirits, conducting healing rituals.
Rachel Beauvoir-Dominique, anthropologist, voodoo expert, and also a member of voodoo priestess. Some short questions for you, please. What is voodoo?
Voodoo is a way of life for the Haitian people, but beyond being a way of life for the Haitian people, it's also a very important religion. It is a spirituality, and it is a culture. And this not only for the Haitian people, but also for all the people of African descent in the New World. That is in Brazil, Candomblé, Santeria, Puerto Rico, and Cuba. In North America, Hoodoo. and the various other forms that exist thanks to the influx of other peoples. You find it in all South Africa, North America, and of course from its roots in Africa, spreading from the Congo region, all of the west coast of Africa, all the way up to the sub-Saharan regions. And so really it is a composite, and what we have in Haiti as Vodou is a microcosm of all of that concentrated in this very small third of an island that we call Haiti, and that spreads to the Dominican Republic and all of the Caribbean.
Are there any evil forces in Vodou?
This is how Vodou has always been characterized, which they call voodoo,
Yes.
and particularly at the time of the American occupation, 1915-1934 in Haiti. And at that time it was necessary because of racism and in order to justify the occupation of Haiti, to show that those people were barbarians, were savages. And so they invented Hollywood's version of Vodou, which is this ancestral religion, which is part of Haitian culture. And in this culture, we don't see that there is evil. We think that the word evil is a construct that comes from other places and is certainly not ours. The good and the bad are very Christian notions, very Manichaean. We think more in terms of grays, of black becoming white and white becoming black, yin and yang.
Yes.
As in the figure of yin and yang, there is a perpetual movement of things. And for us, there is no evil. Things become evil when they are seen in an evil eye, depending on, and we think that what is evil is the occupation, is slavery, which we broke the chains of, is oppression of humanity by other portions of humanity. This is what we consider to be evil. We don't think that in the Vodou culture there is evil as such.
And what about the needles through dolls? Is that something you ever seen, or is that
those
also
are pure
fantasy?
Hollywood constructs that certainly go back to elements perhaps of European heritage, I don't know. We have Paquet Congo, which are charms, and that are generally good luck charms that help to empower individuals in their lives. So they are not made to be aggressive, they are made to the contrary, resist, be able to struggle back, be able to be oneself, in order to be able to assume one individual, social, collective identity, strength, and combativity.
Okay. So why is it so important, this is the last question, to present an exhibition about Voodoo and Haiti?
There are various reasons why that's important. One of the reasons that it's important is because the Haitian people have been so oppressed historically. The colony of Saint-Domingue, which is the old French colony, which was on the territory of Haiti, was one of the most savage and exploitive colonies. This is where France built all their riches upon, and the average lifespan of the slave in Saint-Domingue was 3 to 5 years. They did not have any sleep. They were worked completely to death. And throughout the 19th century till the 20th century, where we're at now, still this oppression has continued, even after the independence, on the Haitian people, who have been considered, particularly during the 19th century, right after the first successful slave revolt, a bad example for the rest of the world. They wouldn't like other slaves to see the same thing. So Haiti was kept apart from the nations, embargo of 60 years. And with this, no schools could be built because they had to pay back, starting in 1825, the French colonists to have their recognition. So then, really, the resources were drained, and Haiti has become one of the most impoverished nations of the world. And because of that, actually, it's the combination of imperialism today, racism worldwide. Haitian nation has to stand for itself in the reconstruction that we need to have today. But beyond that, I think that understanding Vodou culture allows for an understanding of human cultures. And it's also an understanding of the tolerance one needs to have towards the other in their ways of seeing the world, their cosmologies. The beauty of all the different cultures, the fact that we can live together, and that there is no need for fanaticism or intolerance, that we are able to go beyond that. And furthermore, I think for all the people of Black descent, for all the people who are marginalized, excluded, I think that this is a very powerful element of recognizing themselves and their cultures and their identities. It helps the people oppressed, and it's also helping the people who are the oppressors when the way that is presented, the elements of resistance to understand what is going on, how we are understanding this oppression, how we have resisted that oppression, the elements of ridicule, of how things have been presented in a most vulgar and stereotyped manner, the way that we need to change mentalities worldwide.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Okay, great. That was a very insightful video we just shared with you guys. Ajala, do you want to share any views on the video that was just shared?
Well, there was so much food for thought that Professor Dominique provided. Just a little background on her. She's the daughter of Max Beauvoir, who was the supreme Hungan, and a Hungan is a Vodou priest. In Haiti, he has transitioned, as has she, unfortunately. Cancer, she was stricken with cancer and lost a battle with that disease. I spoke to a Vodou priest, an Ewe Vodou priest, and just inquired just a couple of days ago, and inquired about what is the meaning of Vodou. And he broke it down to me thus. He said, Vo means liberty, and Du means community. So Vodou means the spirit of liberty that was brought to the community, right? The spirit of liberty that was brought to the community. The spirit that brings liberty to the community. So it was recognized that African spirituality was very instrumental in promoting and bringing forth liberation, freedom for African people. And we see that during the revolution that sparked in August 1791 in Bois-Caiman in Saint-Domingue at that time, and culminated with the declaration of the land as a free republic under Jean-Jacques Dessalines on January 1st, 1804. He renamed Saint-Domingue Haiti, right, which was an original Taino name. So with Vodou, you have African people utilizing their spiritual weaponry in order to liberate the territory known as Saint-Domingue, right? So very much our spirituality and our liberation struggles were operating hand in glove. So Vodou, and that's exactly why it's being, it has been demonized from the time of the African resistance up until the present day. Because if African people across the globe, in the diaspora as well as at home on the continent, tapped into the power that is their indigenous African spirituality, then the whole balance of power in the world could potentially shift. What that means is that white supremacy as we know it would be upended, because we've tapped into the power, the divine power of our spirituality, and have used it, have chosen to use it to free ourselves and free our lands, to get the white monkey literally off our backs. So Vodou is a powerful, powerful weapon, and that's exactly why, you know, through Hollywood misrepresentation, they have promulgated the propaganda which convinces African people that what you are dealing with is some witchcraft. Nothing could be further from the truth, you know.
Yeah, that's excellent explanation, Jala. And yeah, just adding to that, you get to see, like you said, propaganda is out there, and you have to be so careful because they put the propaganda out there to have you thinking many things that are not there to benefit you when they're entirely there to serve you. And so you're looking the other way when you should be looking towards that way. So that's an excellent explanation. Appreciate that. Carlson, I know you had mentioned you had a few questions as well too, so I guess you could join in with your questions.
Definitely, but just to make sure that our panelists had didn't have questions before I jump into it, you guys can type into the chat box and or raise your hand if anything piqued your curiosity regarding the last topic.
Yeah, I don't see any questions.
No hands? Okay, no problem. Oh, one hand. Thank you for the clarification and explanation about voodoo. Not a problem. So you brought a lot of stuff up, Ajala, and the video brought a lot of stuff up, and the explanation from Gina as well. I'd like to sort of go into 18th, 17th century, and then look into 2020 and ask, what do we do as descendants of West Africans that reflects many of the traditions and spiritual practices that were brought over from our original homelands?
Good question. There's so much unacknowledged African spiritual retentions that we see, ironically, I suppose, in the Euro-Christian church, right? The way we catch the spirit and the way we talk in tongues, the spirit possession is very much part of the African spiritual tradition, the part of the tradition that we brought with us when the savages came and invaded our lands and shipped us off through brute force and savagery to the so-called West. Well, we brought all of those with us, right? And because we weren't allowed to worship in the way that we had worshiped at home, we found new homes for the way that we worship. And one of the homes was the Euro-Christian church. So we Africanized that space. Again, talking in tongues is one aspect. The way we are spirited, literally spirited in our singing. You know, if you go to a white church, you don't see that. White church starts at 10 o'clock. It's wrapped up by 11:15. Yeah, we're done. But as you saw in the video while Professor Dominique was speaking, it was interspersed with scenes from a Vodou ritual, and you would see us engaging in the sound, the music, and the moving of the body. So we worship with our whole entire selves, right? So that very much is an African retention that you can still see here in 2020 if you go to any number of churches here in Bermuda, right? You see that. The Pentecostal tradition is replete with that very performative, emotional aspect of African spirits into the conversation that we have with our spirituality. We have it with our entire beings, right? It's not an intellectual exercise. It's very much head, it's very much body, spirit, flesh, all interspersed and in conversation with the divine. And we haven't lost that, even though we have been 400 years removed from home, and for many of us, 400 years removed from our ancient spiritual practices.
Definitely. That's such a great answer. And it's funny when you said practicing spirituality with the whole body, because that's certainly what I've seen growing up and experiencing different churches. So it's another point that was made was that as you said, physical versus intellectual. So for a lot of West African spiritual,
there's no and Professor Dominique made that point. I don't ever want to set up some sort of dichotomy between the two, the physical and intellectual.
Yeah, the binary, yeah, and it's one.
As she said, that's very Manichaean. That's very good versus bad. We don't do that.
Yeah.
There's the complementarity of seeming opposites, right? So the intellectual is the emotional, is the physical. All of that is connected and in relationship and in communion and conversation and communication, right? So,
right.
Let's point that out.
We have a question here from one of the guest attendees. The question is, when was the video made and what is being done to remove the voodoo stigma of voodoo?
I think it was maybe in 2000 and the early 2000s. I don't know exactly when, but the early 2000s, because I think, correct me if I'm wrong, I don't have anything here to look it up, but I think she passed in 2009, I want to say. Regarding the second part of the question, Hollywood has worked overtime to promote misinformation and anti-Blackness in regards to anything to do with voodoo. So many of us would say, wow, the needles and dolls, that's part of voodoo. Hot garbage, nonsense, right? That is a Hollywood fiction. But it was a Hollywood fiction that was invented and spread for the sole purpose of convincing us that what liberated us in the land we now know as Haiti is somehow negative, is somehow evil, and is most definitely something we should be in full flight away from. Yeah? Again, the only spiritual tradition was an indigenous one. The only spiritual tradition that had the capacity to liberate an entire land was Vodou. Many thousands of years old, made the journey across the big water to the place called Saint-Domingue, and the people used that as a tool to free themselves. So if you wanted slavery, the idea of slavery was to keep in perpetuity an entire people in bondage, in perpetuity, forever and ever, amen.
Yeah.
Haiti's greatest crime was that it shattered the myth of white invincibility. And it's for that crime, unforgivable, high treason against white supremacy, that they're still paying for it to this day. And the weapon used has to be demonized constantly.
Yeah, I would just like to add something to that on top of what y'all are saying. I'm going to just read directly from, and we want to thank Dr. Clarence Maxwell. He's on the call today, so I'm actually reciting his work right now. So just on top of what Jala said, I'm sharing with you guys from Dr. Clarence Maxwell an article called "The Horrid Villainy: Sarah Bassett and the Poisoning Conspiracies in Bermuda, 1727 to 1730." And on page 41 here, he says, the first and probably only explicit statement that would place in Bermuda, it was Obia. Therefore, the Obiefo in Bermuda came from Joshua Marsden. He was a Methodist missionary, part of the Methodist missionary church that we have here still in Bermuda. He was sent to Bermuda in the 1800s, and he wrote disparagingly of it. Some few among them, he complained, possess a species of witchcraft or obiism, obia. This, he called it, this detestable imposture does not so much prevail in Bermuda as in some of the other West India islands, and is always renounced the moment they become serious. Marsden's views obviously reflect sectarianism. His immediate concern was to propagate the Methodist gospel, and he conceived of obia as in the way of his work. Now you find that interesting? Very interesting. But a lot of this is in the history, and that's why it's important that we do our research. So I just want to share that with you guys. This is what a Methodist minister that came here to Bermuda, this is what he had to say about the Africans that were in Bermuda, what he thought about them practicing obia, even though it was in traditional belief system. It was in the way of his work.
And one thing Ajala says all the time about how the purpose of Christianity in the Black lives was to destroy and control. He says it by far much more beautiful and by far much more eloquently than I could ever say it. But that rings in my head all the time when I think about stuff like that.
Yeah. We also have another question. Thanks, Gina. What is the difference between voodoo and voodoo? They spelled it V-U-D-U and then V-O-D-U-O.
It's probably voodoo. How did they say it in the U.S.? Voodoo and voodoo. And the woman kind of explained it, didn't she? One is the Hollywood version, and one is the actual religion of the Africans.
And also,
go do it.
There are many derivations that you can find. There's across the Americas, for example, there's things like hoodoo. So again, these are all because we came here with an understanding of matters spiritual. We came here with that, but we were under constant threat. our practices, our spiritual practices were demonized. We were really encouraged, if you will, to forget these things and to cast them aside, but we didn't. So we, under the cover of darkness, if you will, or under camouflage, we kept our retentions going and sometimes changed them slightly according to where we were geographically. So for example, with something like Ifa, which was the spiritual practice of the Yoruba people, you would find them showing up in various parts of the Americas as candomblé, for example, in Brazil, I believe it's in Brazil, Santeria, you would find that, you know, or Lukumi, you would find all these examples of voodoo, not voodoo, of Ifa, looking slightly different, but still very much connected based upon people's geographical locations, right? Because again, we were attempting to mine our spirituality under the lash, while the shackles were still affixed to our wrists. We did this under pressure. And so we had to acknowledge where we were geographically and tweak our spiritual practices accordingly.
Yeah, exactly. Do you have anything, other questions you want to share, Carlson?
Sure. If you could expand a bit on the botanical chemistry aspect and the usage of that with how Africans enslaved at that time used that knowledge to assist in getting through the different climates and elements as such.
Okay. So I'll just restate that question, please.
Sure. So the question is, what were some of the known healing methods that enslaved Africans used to protect themselves from disease? And that would be, of course, related to aspects of botanical chemistry and knowledge from their homelands.
Yeah. Well, we definitely, again, we came with the knowledge of the sciences as well, firmly entrenched in our consciousness, and we would definitely have used them to heal ourselves. For example, I know with there was a smallpox outbreak in the New World, and the knowledge that an African by the name of Onesimus, I want to think his name is Onesmus. He shared with his enslaved rapist, I think his name was Cotton Mather. And he, one of the things that he did was he used the pus from a person infected with smallpox, made a small incision in the flesh and rubbed the pox in. What that did was it inoculated him and his folk against the disease of smallpox. Well, this was knowledge that again came across the seas, right? And it was also this knowledge of science, medical science essentially, that allowed African people, again, with the slightest of tweaks, to turn their, and Gina had alluded to it earlier, to turn their healing capacity into a weapon, essentially chemical warfare, if you will, that they engaged in order to break the back of bondage in the lands where they were to be found. So it's you see it in Bermuda, you see it in Jamaica. In fact, in Saint-Domingue, I think in the mid-1700s, Macandal, an African from Saint-Domingue, he had a poisoning school that he ran. He would train folk in how to engage their knowledge of botanical chemistry to weaponize it in order to strike back against their oppressors.
Okay, I have some.
Fascinating.
Yeah, that's excellent. So I have some questions and comments coming in, so I'm gonna just share them. Dr. Maxwell, thank you, because he's answering some of our questions.
That's Bermuda. That's Bermuda right there.
He says, voodoo.
What's up, Clarence?
He says, voodoo was the transliteration of it in English. Voodoo reflects the exact pronunciation of it.
Voodoo.
Yeah. Yeah, and he said that you pronounced the name you pronounced the name right, Ajala.
Okay, cool.
And also another questions came in for you, Jalas, asked, could you elaborate and explain what you mean by enslaver rapists?
Oh, well, I think the Chinese have a saying, you know, calling a thing is the beginning of wisdom. And I think we would do well to get in line with that practice when looking at the people who came and despoiled civilizations wherever their alabaster feet touched soil. So when they came over to Africa, that's what they did. They invaded Africa. You know, they raped en masse African peoples, men, women, and children. Right? They kidnapped us, they stripped us, and they enslaved us. Right? That's what they did. So they were invader, enslaver, rapists. That's what they are. Right? And again, it's important to call them that so that we are it allows us to disabuse ourselves of the notion that they are anything other than a gaggle of psychopaths who fell upon the motherland Africa, descended upon the motherland Africa like a toxic cloud. Monstrous. These are monstrous human beings. Okay. Yeah, enslaver rapist. I think that's a title that they wear well. They've earned the right to be called what they are.
Yeah, because you were able to, you said, because before I remember you said it was like 3 things. Mm-hmm. You said the raping of the person, the land, the culture. Mm-hmm. You could elaborate just a little bit on that? Or? Okay. Well, yeah. When you think of mm-hmm. conquest of Africa and of peoples, that took place on 3 fronts. So the invasion and conquest of the land, first the landmass known as Africa, right? They came in with their superior weaponry and their superiority in the superiority of the European is shown in the savage superiority of the European is shown in his complete lack of a working functional conscience. So there are things that he was able to do that other peoples, Africans and other peoples of color, simply couldn't imagine doing to the earth and to the people, just couldn't imagine doing, right? So they were able to, again, with their superior weaponry, come in and physically conquer the land, right? And then with enslavement, they were able to physically conquer the bodies of African people through taking them from their land, transporting them across the oceans, and forcibly dispersing them across the savage West. The third, I'll come to after I explain how we push back against the first mm-hmm. 2 aspects of our conquest. Well, we started with the independence movement, right? Reclaiming our land, wresting control of our land as best we could from the invader rapist and his descendants, right? His equally morally bankrupt descendants. So that began with the independence movement that gave birth to Ghana. Ghana being brought to independence by Kwame Nkrumah in 1957, I believe it was. And Ghana actually means warrior king, right? Across the continent, there followed a rolling series of independence campaigns that went right down into the 80s, right? You would see that. And then throughout the Caribbean as well, where Africans were the predominant racial majority. So we were able to push back and reclaim the land, if you will. The resistance movements from anything from what happened during the Stono uprising or the Nat Turner uprising or what was planned in Bermuda in 1761, all of these aborted, unsuccessful, and successful acts of insurrection, principal among them being the Haitian Revolution. That was us reclaiming our bodies, our personhood, our human agency, right? So the body was liberated, and in 1834 resulted in the abolition of slavery, August 1st, 1834
in Bermuda and Antigua. 4 years later in the other British territories, in places like Cuba and Brazil. It didn't happen until the 1880s. But what you saw was the reclamation, as much as was possible, of our human agency, right? We physically removed the shackles from around our ribs, our wrists. The third area of conquest, however, is one that we're grappling with to this day, and that is the conquest of the spirit. Now, Hollywood, we mentioned earlier, had really done an outstanding job convincing us that our spiritual practices were malignant cancers from a morally bankrupt and backward time in our history, right? Why would you want to go back to, don't they, you know, voodoo dolls and all of that? Right? So as a result of that, in conjunction with our conditioning to accept our bondage and to accept the white maleness of the divine being, right? Because if God is a white male and his son looks like one of the members of the Bee Gees, and he also looks a whole lot like the people who are raping and enslaving us, what chance do we have but to be subservient, but to be hewers of wood and drawers of water? That is our lot in life. And it's backed up by the word of God. Ephesians verse 5 references, you know, admonishes slaves to be thou obedient to thy masters. And again, the white enslaver rapists use these, weaponize these words against African people. You know, it was used to keep us in line. And of course, imagery is very powerful. Not only the voodoo doll, the invention of Hollywood, but also the invention of the whiteness of a man who in Revelations 1 verse 14 and 15, Jesus I'm speaking of, was described as having hair like lamb's wool and skin like burnt brass. In other words, he would look like Dr. Clarence Maxwell. Right? Not like a member of the Bee Gees. But if you go to the AME church just up the street, right, you would see white folk all on the stained glass windows. So that's the power of the myth. We can read the text. It tells us one thing. Very clearly, you're talking about the description of a brother. But the stained glass windows in St. Paul African Methodist Episcopal Church tells a different story. And what we see, we believe. It dovetails with what we've been taught through force of the lash for several hundred years, and then through force of Eurocentric Christian propaganda. So we have yet to cast that particular monkey off our backs, right? We've Africanized, as I said earlier, we've Africanized these spaces, right? But we haven't liberated ourselves completely and fully from the intolerable whiteness that is still therein.
Yeah, so that's a great explanation, Jala. Yeah, it is great. And yes, we do not have any time to pack all of that today. So that was clearly another, Zoom presentation, just even on a whole lot of that of religion. And, you know, that's definitely history. We have to really get into the history before slavery, because there's a lot of history before slavery that we have to dive into. And that will be, again, on another presentation. I have a commenter. This is one of my favorite comments as well, too. Someone put West African proverb, until the lion tells his side of the story, the tale of the hunt will always glorify the hunter. And that is so true. And that's what we're here doing today. You know, we have to dive into and have these talks so that our children would even know what's happened, what's truly happened in history, And we have to do that. We're responsible for that. We can't be saying we have to wait for the schools to do it and all these sorts of things. This is time for us now to really do a deep dive into our history. And then I have another question for you, Jala. This is going to be the last question, then we're going to move on to the next segment of the presentation. Can you speak about the myth of Africans as enslavers of fellow Africans, a concept often used as a defense of the transatlantic slave trade and Africans selling other Africans to the Europeans?
Yeah, that's one tried and tested racist fiction, right? And it greatly oversimplifies the realities of having to contend with the conquest of your particular village, for example, in the face of the Gatling gun. Again, superior firepower and the signal absence of a functioning moral compass allows this gaggle of sociopaths to do anything under the sun to both the planet itself and the people who call planet Earth home. Right? So what we see when we are looking at, how can I say this? When we are looking at, just ask that second part of the question again.
The second part of the question is,
Or the question.
Well, I'll do the question again. Speak to the myth of Africans as enslavers of fellow Africans.
Yes, that's it.
Yeah.
So it is important to recognize that some of these decisions were made under threat of death. For example, you were given this a choice like this: either you go and lay waste to that village over there and bring me some people, or I take your people. And what are you going to do? I have superior weaponry, right? So you now have a choice to make. Under extreme duress, my people, my sister, my brother, my uncles, the elders, or that village over there, right? So we understand that this was the backstory behind the myth, right? You have been forced under great coercion, under the threat of death yourself and for those you love, to make a decision that we otherwise would never have made. And also understand that slavery in Africa and slavery and European chattel slavery, even though jackasses like William Zuhl would beg to differ, sorry about that, I'll call him something else, historians would beg to differ. They didn't, never the twain shall meet, right? Your humanity wasn't stripped from you, right? It was often, slavery on the continent was often relegated to those who were prisoners of war or debtors, for example, right? And it wasn't something that they could pass, it wasn't something that was tied to the hue of skin, right? And we were fighting against that, even as we were forced into these deals with the devil. We were still fighting, like Queen and Zinga, fighting, yeah? Fighting, always fighting. From the time of the time that the first ships docked on the West African coast, we were fighting, even though they had superior firepower, even though we were forced into these decisions, you know, that no human being should ever have to be forced into. Yeah.
Yeah, so I just also have Dr. Maxwell also said his answer to that is also there was also a lot of African resistance to human trafficking that is always unemphasized.
Yeah, I mean, and that's the thing, because there are revisionist, what I call exculpatory revisionists, people, white so-called historians, who write the stories of African people in ways that absolve their bloodthirsty ancestors of culpability, right? So they're the ones who are pushing that particular narrative. Well, Africans did it to themselves. No. That's not true. That's absolutely as far from the truth as, you know, Pluto is from Earth.
Exactly, yeah, and that's more discussions that, of course, you guys look forward to that, because we do have some friends over in Ghana who's going to actually, we're setting up, having a presentation with them later on in the year, and I've been to Ghana, and I've kept in contact with them, and, you know, we're good. It's like, if you get the chance to go over there, visit there, and you could even have some of these conversations with the folks in Ghana, and they would explain a lot to you, but so that's another presentation we'll get to about the slave castles all along the coast there, and how the Europeans came in, and lots of times they stole the people. Lots of times they just outright steal them. You know, people would get up and not even know that their sister's going missing or somebody's going missing who went walking on the street. They literally stole people. They have family members that they haven't even seen, and then they come to find out that they must have been taken on a lot of their slave ships. So there's a lot of stories that we don't know of on this side, and especially now we are in an era where we can reconnect with the diaspora, and we could go find out these questions ourselves. We really can. So
and it's really necessary for just that, Rashida. I think it's part of us putting ourselves back together and understanding that a great trauma was visited upon us.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And that trauma endures to the extent that we don't recognize it as such.
Exactly.
And the initial act of violation, what the Kiswahili term is maafa. Maafa standing for, translated to mean the great disaster, right? The breaking of a continent, right? The stripping of a continent of its youngest, best, and brightest, yeah, for hundreds of years. You don't recover from that in even a century. It takes a while. And then the erasure of the reality of that fundamental breaking that occurred. We don't even tell the truth about it. So that's a second violence done to us as a people. We're here in, wounded, bloody, battered, and we don't know how we got to this place. We don't know the story of what brought us here and what is still making us ill.
Exactly, and that's the highlight of it all. What is still making us ill, and why are many of us still suffering to this day? It's 500 years, and many of us are still suffering. So that's why these talks are so important, and we plan to continue them. So we're going to move on to the next segment of the presentation. And we're going to just share a short video, an intro. We're going right into Sarah Sally Bassett, a symbol of resistance in the face of injustice. Her story matters. Women's voices matters.
Her story is as striking as the new statue in her honor. Sally Bassett is Bermuda's most often told slave story.
I see her as a hero. I really do.
Sally Bassett was tied, shackled, and burned at the stakes. It was a public execution of a grandmother. Many bore witness. Bermuda's Chief Justice ordered the execution following a trial for petty treason. Sally was accused of trying to poison 2 slave owners in 1730. She was a criminal, but history has ordained her as a hero. Bermuda government kept registers for slaves like Sally. Those registers now open to the world. All over Bermuda, Black history is highlighted no matter how unpleasant. It's the promise of the African Diaspora Heritage Trail, a trail that now includes a monument to an enslaved Bermudian, a woman standing as proudly, as defiantly as she lived. Her story.
Okay, so that's it. So Jolly, you want to share your views?
I think I heard Elder Florence Maxwell's voice there. I think I heard her voice. Would I be correct in that? I think so.
I think that was
Yes.
her, yes.
Yes, that was her.
Yeah.
And one thing that she said, and I included it in my upcoming book, a quote from her, and she's not one to suffer fools gladly, for those of you who know her. Dr. Maxwell would know this better than I. But one of the things she said is that slavery nowhere was benign. Right? Here, it was equally as brutal and as cruel. Right? And so she was rubbishing the idea, again, that has been promulgated by exculpatory revisionists masquerading as historians, people like Dr. Michael Jarvis, Dr. Virginia Bernhard, William Zuhl, and others, right? They're misrepresenting our reality, right? Because these are our egun. Egun is the word for ancestor, but translated literally means bone. And the idea being that our ancestors are our flesh and bone. They live within us, right? So how dare you misrepresent the reality of my people's suffering? You don't have the right to do that. So until lions have historians, hunters will Only when lions have historians will hunters cease being heroes. That's the real practice of people like Professor Maxwell, Professor Swan, Professor Theodore Francis, Professor Christy Warren, and others who are doing this very necessary reclamation work and excavation and explication work. Very important. To that end, I want to share an excerpt from my book, because I believe in writing for young people. Writing for anybody. Anybody wants to read the stuff, can feel free. But I think it's important to tell our stories to the young so they can understand the world that they're in. Right? So this is taken an excerpt from my book entitled A Tale of Two Women, Sally Bassett, Mary Prince, and the True Story of Slavery in Bermuda. It was as if the sun itself had drawn closer to the island in an effort to see more clearly what was about to take place. The court had found her guilty and ordered that she be killed today. Her screams of agony and the stench of burning flesh would soon fill the air. It promised to be a gruesome sight. Of this, they were certain. A sea of pale, sweat-slicked faces surrounded her. Children, peeking from behind the protection of their parents' forearms, stared at the old Black woman standing atop the pile of sticks. She, silent and unbowed, stared back. But inside, her mind was screaming. They calling me a witch? A killer? They stole my life, and they never gave it back. Nobody yet been punished for that. Anger overcame her as she glared at the gathering cloud. I don't deserve this. They're the ones guilty, not me. If I killed them all, every last godforsaken slave owning one of them, I could never be guilty, and I would never be sorry. Flaming torch in hand, the executioner approached. He thrust the torch into the kindling, and within minutes, the ominous crackling of burning wood was heard. She searched the crowd for Black faces, locking eyes with an old man and a young girl who reminded her so much of her beloved Beck. She read the silent support and simmering rage hidden beneath their guarded gaze. She was not alone. As the acrid smoke rose to her nostrils, she felt a twinge of fear. In spite of it, and in defiance of the ropes that bound her to the stake, she drew herself up to her full height. She was afraid. Who wouldn't be? But she refused to give her killers any indication of how she was feeling. They wanted her blood, and they would soon have their wish, but they would never take her pride. Feeling the heat growing beneath her bare and calloused feet, she smiled. An expression of joy in the face of impending death? A murmur of confusion traveled through the assembled onlookers. Many took this as definitive proof that she was indeed an evil conjurer, the cursed Black spawn of the devil himself. Burn the witch, someone screamed. Soon the chant of burn the witch rippled through the crowd. She could feel their eyes boring into her, could see the veins bulging in their necks, their clenched fists desperately stabbing the air. And she could almost taste their fear. Her smile widened as the chanting grew to a fever pitch. So that's an excerpt taken from my book. Now, Sally Bassett was, by the time she was first present in the historical record, she was already like in middle age, essentially about, I believe, 50 years old or so, or thereabouts. And she shows up because of a court case where she, along with Indian John, were brought in front of the magistrate to face charges of uttering threatening words and destroying property. Now, according to the witnesses, Sally Bassett is alleged to have, several months prior, said to Captain John Jennings that on the appointed day, January 26th, something was going to go down. And on January 26th, when livestock died and property was destroyed, Well, naturally, suspicion fell upon Bassett, who uttered these threats, allegedly, and Indian Tom. Well, Indian Tom, the threats were uttered against both Captain Jennings and Captain Stephen Painter. Indian John was found guilty and was banished. Banishment simply meant that you had to leave the island, and were you to attempt to return and were discovered, you could face summary execution. Right? So they decided that because it was felt that were he allowed to remain here in the Devil's Isles, then Captain Painter's life would be under threat. So they shipped him off. Sally Bassett was found not guilty of destroying property, but was found guilty of uttering threatening words. And for that, she was whipped. That was her punishment. By any stretch of the imagination, what this middle-aged Black woman had to endure was nothing short of horrific. Whipped every 30 paces with 3 lashes laid on hard, from the western end of Southampton Parish to the eastern end of that same parish. All right? So you're talking in excess of 100 lashes, at least 100 lashes, that would result in the lacerating of the flesh of her back. She would have been, by the time she reached the eastern end of Southampton Parish, she would have been drenched in her own blood. All right? This is what they did to this Black woman. All right? And again, to go back to what Ms. Maxwell had said, slavery nowhere in Bermuda was benign, nowhere. It was equally monstrous, equally cruel, here as it was in Barbados, as it was in Jamaica, as it was in Saint Domingue, as it was in Antigua, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Bermuda, far from what the fiction peddlers like Professor Jarvis and others would have you believe, was not another world, all right? Where the enslaved and the enslaver somehow made hay. No, that was anything but the truth. She shows up again some 18 years later in 1730, facing another court case. In this case, she is accused of being the mastermind behind an attempted poisoning of Sarah Foster, her husband, and an enslaved girl by the name of Nancy. She is alleged to have given her granddaughter Beck, who was in the house, a domestic in the home of the Fosters, poisons, some of which would be added to the food, some of which would be placed in the slats, so that anybody inhaling, as the breeze came through, inhaling the fumes would be struck down, laid low. Ultimately, the aim was to have them and their lives separated from one another. Right? Again, using botanical chemistry. Interesting note, white toad was one of the ingredients used in the killer cocktail. But white toad wouldn't have been readily available here in Bermuda. So it begs the question, from whence did it come? Well, white toad, interesting enough, was an ingredient used during voodoo rituals in Saint Domingue. Yeah, how did it get to Bermuda? Well, one can surmise that the enslaved mariners would have been the people who would have smuggled the contraband in. Enslaved mariners had the run of the oceans, relatively speaking, of course, and they were highly skilled mariners. You know, somebody like Jemmy Darrell, you know, if you go to St. George's, his house is still there, was a master of the oceans, just simply a master. I think he was called a king's pilot. You know, he was the elite of the elite. Well, they would smuggle in this contraband. They would smuggle in information, you know, about what is happening in other areas of the Atlantic region, from Antigua to Jamaica and so on. They would be the information bringers, right? We would see another instance of mariners smuggling in contraband with the importation through, again, the sailors of Marcus Garvey's The Negro World newspapers. You know, that was also smuggled in by sailors because, again, the white elites here in Bermuda didn't want seditious materials like the Negro world in the hands of Black Bermudians, for fear that we might resist. Right? So she has these poisons, and she is alleged to have instructed her granddaughter Beck in how to use them. Well, she was found guilty of all charges and was sentenced to burn at the stake. The court case having taken place in St. George's. Well, the foot of the lane was the area chosen for her execution. Now, at that time, the foot of the lane was occupied a much wider catchment area, if you will, than what we understand it to be now, down by Johnny Barnes statue. Yeah, many of us believe that that is the actual location where she was burned at the stake. But according to independent researcher Leonie Juno, she's done a lot of background work on just trying to find exactly where she was executed. She has shared with me that actually, yeah, it's a much wider area than we had previously understood it to be. So hopefully, with her work, we will eventually come to discover exactly where Sally Bassett was executed. The kindling was set alight, and some hours after it was first put to flame, Sally Bassett's body was reduced to smoking ashes. The legend has it that out of the ashes was found growing the Bermudiana, which is Bermuda's national flower. A couple of things as well. She was adjudged to have been valued at £1, 4 shillings and 6 pence, which in today's funds would be 200 British pounds, right? And again, African people under chattel slavery weren't recognized as human beings. They were property. So instead of a human being being executed, what you would have been asked to look at Sally Bassett as is a piece of property that is being destroyed, for which financial compensation had to be made. So that's why it was important to just affix a value on this lost property, right? Not a human being, not a human being. Under chattel slavery, chattel meaning movable property, we weren't considered human beings, yeah? Fast forward a few hundred years, and it was decided that we needed some statuary. We needed a monument of some sort to celebrate the martyred revolutionary warrior woman known as Sarah Sally Bassett. Well, interestingly enough, the first place where the statue was, they had a conversation about placing it would have been at City Hall, right on the grounds of City Hall. But some white and Black business people, as well as the then mayor of Hamilton, Sutherland Medeiros, they raised quite a hue and cry. And it was decided that no, we couldn't place the statue there, all right? And we can have a discussion about why that might have been, Ultimately, it was decided that the statue created by Carlos Dowling in 2009, when it was officially unveiled, would be placed on cabinet grounds, tucked away, if you will, not front and center, but tucked away. If you blink, you can miss it, right? Also, there was supposed to have been a forever flame burning about its base, but again, for whatever reason, it was decided that that is not perhaps aesthetically pleasing. I don't know, What I do know is that it's not there, all right? Carlos Dowling, interesting though, faced a lot of blowback as a result of his decision to create this larger-than-life monument to somebody who was attempting to kill innocent white people, innocent enslaver rapists, right? So as a result, white Bermudians withdrew their patronage, right? And he suffered financially as a result. And therein lies something that we need to discuss. Our history is uncomfortable to the descendants of those rapists and slavers. It's uncomfortable. Why do we have to talk about this? I recognize, yes, reparations were paid to my ancestors, to the tune of, in Bermuda at least, just over 50,000 pounds. And your ancestors got, I suppose, a wink and a prayer, a stick of bubble gum, and I hope you fare thee well, if you will. Yeah. But why do we have to bring that up? Why do we have to talk about this? So with the statue being placed, for example, at City Hall grounds, front and center in the middle of the city of Hamilton, we would have to engage in certain uncomfortable conversations that clearly, as a community, we are not yet ready to do. We're not ready to engage front and center in the types of uncomfortable conversations that we desperately have to have. And so the furor over the Sally Bassett monument really brings into sharp relief our acute discomfort when it comes to engaging critically with our story as African people. And that's amongst European Bermudians, as well as Africans here in Bermuda, the descendants of people like Sally Bassett. So we've yet to really come to terms with that, with the myriad, numberless crimes that were committed against us here in this Isle of Devils, aptly named indeed. So I'll just stop there.
Okay, that was excellent, excellent. Wow, that's excellent. I always find it so interesting in her story. You had Indian Tom, and they were accused at first together, but he was banished out of the island, and she was whipped. And then we hear of her later on in 1730, and because she practiced her obeah. And research has been showing that the enslavement community, they viewed her as a healer. She was a healer. She was someone they would go to as a healer. And she was as an educator too, because not when you're doing obeah, that's nothing someone could learn overnight. That was something that you had to teach somebody. That's why you said it was the schools down there in Haiti and stuff like that. And sometimes they even said too, not every African was good at it. So if you weren't good at it, they were not going to teach you. It was very, so the ones that were taught, it's an honor for them to be having taught that. And then, like you said, we have the white community who viewed her as a witch. And also in the historical records, you'll see they viewed a lot of women as witches in Bermuda. But what you found with her was that they burnt her. The other witches, most of the other witches, the punishment was usually to get hung. Of course, it's still death. But hers was to be hung. What would you say even about that, Ajala? Hers was to be burnt at the stake. What would you have to say about that? It's like they was really trying to send some type of message.
Yep, yeah.
Yeah, and again, the court case, her court case was done in the Assize Court in St. George's at that time, because Hamilton was not the capital. Hamilton didn't become the capital of Bermuda until the 1800s. And so we have her court case having taken place in St. George's, but she gets burnt at the stake down at Crow Lane. So, what would you have to say, elaborate, I guess, a little bit.
Yeah, well, I think it's the use of a public act of terrorism, right? Not unlike where at Gibbet Island, the heads of African people would be affixed to stakes. Again, public spectacle, as terrorism. Terrorism as public spectacle, I'm sorry, right? So that other Africans, enslaved Africans, would see this very in-your-face demonstration of white violence against Black bodies and say, you know what, I need to just fall in line because I don't want to end up like those folk whose heads are on the stakes at Gibbet Island. That was the intent, of course, behind what happened at Gibbet Island and at other sites across the island, for that matter. Public spectacle, terrorism as public spectacle. What you see with Sally Bassett in particular is that it's the recognition of the power of Black women too, right? As wise women, I think the old English translation of witch is Wicca, right? W-I-C-C-A. And part of it is the craft of the wise woman, right? And so seeing the way that African people could manipulate herbs and things of that nature and combine them just so that they become deadly, right? You can put some poison in the food in January, in February, March. By December, that white person's dead. His whole family's gone, you know? So that is, it seemed to them to be magic. What manner of sorcery? You know, she must be spawn of the devil, as I spoke of in the dramatic reading that I shared with you all. Right? She must be spawn of the devil. What person would do this? There's a term, drapetomania, that Europeans came up with. They stay tripping, and basically, drapetomania was an affliction that enslaved Africans suffered that made them run away from slavery. Drapetomania. You know, why would you want to run away from slavery? You know, it's in. So yeah, they would, in order to engage in the public spectacle, in order to send a message to enslaved people, she was brought, I believe, by boat from St. George's because that was the way, that was the primary way that folk traveled about the island, right? To Hamilton. So that enslaved people at every stage of that voyage would see this woman, would know what was about to happen to this woman. And when she was ultimately burned at the stake and foot of the lane, could witness the public execution of this woman. Again, terrorism as public spectacle with the intent of frightening African people, enslaved African Bermudians, into a grudging obedience of their enslaver rapists.
Yes, it was, you know, it's always this, like you said, terroristic tyranny that African people, Black people are always under, this tyranny, but then it's always switched around in that they become the victim. And it's like, she's an enslaved woman.
Hmm.
What else is there to say about that? She's an enslaved woman.
I think one point that definitely has to be made is that even if she were quote unquote guilty of trying to kill not just Sarah Foster, her husband, I think his name was John Foster. Oh, interesting connection. Sarah Foster was the daughter of John Jennings, and John Jennings was the man who Sally Bassett was whipped for threatening in 1712. So was this part of a revenge plan? Maybe, but it's far likelier that she was part of what was happening in Bermuda during that time, the poison plots, you know, poisoning used as a means of resistance, right? Fighting against oppression, brilliantly fighting against oppression. Again, using what Carlson has spoken about earlier, their knowledge of botanical chemistry as a weapon against those who would seek to have them in bondage from the time they were born to the time that they died, took their last breath.
Okay, so I just have one statement here, just saying that the court case was held at the State House, and the State House was in St. George's too. I didn't have any. Carlson, did you have, I believe you said you had some questions you wanted to share?
Let me just make one final point. Yeah. Even if she were, yeah, that was the point that I wanted to make. Even if she were guilty, quote unquote, of poisoning all of the folk that she is, you know, if she actually did that, she was still actually, at a deeper level, absolutely 100% not guilty, because the original crime was chattel slavery. The original criminals, the perpetrators of that crime, were white European enslaver rapists. Anything, therefore, that I do to make right that which was done wrong against me, I'm completely in my rights to do so. And nothing you can accuse me with. Let's say if I killed every last white man, woman, and child in the parish of Southampton, not guilty. You shouldn't have enslaved us. So during the conspiracy of 1761, our ancestors understood that and were about to put it into practice, right? The wholesale extermination of every white man, woman, and child in the Isle of Bermuda, because they recognized and embraced the reality of the matter. the reality of the matter being that the fundamental crime, the original crime committed against us, was the crime of chattel slavery and all of the vile depredations that were that issued from that poison source. So anything that I do, therefore, to cast that particular alabaster monkey off my back, I am well within my rights to do, up to and including mass murder.
Yeah. So just before I got to Carlson, I just wanted to go on the tip of that also. I'm not sure if many people know that slavery was not really legal in Bermuda. It wasn't a law. It was something that evolved over time. The first colored people that came here to the island, the first Africans, they came here as indentured servants. And then they had their indentured servitude for 7 years. And then afterwards, the enslavers changed that indentured servitude to 99 years, hence making them enslaved people. So if anybody has a case against reparations, really is a lot of Black Bermudians, they do have a case against reparations because it wasn't like a law like in the United States. It was an actual law. In other countries, it was a law. They didn't make it. It wasn't a law here. It was just something. It was just a horrible monster. I like how the law puts it. It was an odious. It was an odious issue that happened here in Bermuda, and it was never officially a law. It was just something that evolved over time. So if I change your indentured servitude from 7 years to 99 years, hence that makes you a slave, an enslaved person. So I just wanted to just go on the tip of that. And I guess I'll hand it over to Carlson.
Great, thanks, Gina. And sorry, Rashida, got the two of you mixed up. And thank you, Ajala, for that great explanation. So many different angles and things that can come out of that story. Particularly one that stuck out to me was Sally Bassett as a healer and as a figure in the community of enslaved Africans in Bermuda. Another one was the fact that she instructed the child to give the poison to another enslaved child known as Nancy. So this would be effectively, you know, in 21st century, like a Black on Black kind of thing. So if you could speak to some of the context of the poisoning of Nancy and perhaps why she would want to kill another enslaved African.
Mm-hmm. Well, when the axe came to the forest, the trees said, "Look, the handle is one of us." That's an African proverb. And some people are axe handles. Some people, in other words, some African people work against the interests of other African peoples. And in this case, some African people work against the interests of African liberation. Now, Dr. Maxwell, you could, yes, okay. Dr. Maxwell says that Nancy may well have been an accident. Okay, thank you for that. Yeah, that's possible as well. And I think that's a good point to make. It may also have been that she could have been caught up in an unhealthy affection for her enslavers as well. And so Sally Bassett made the decision that she too must be put down. A similar situation showed itself during the conspiracy of 1761, when part of the planning involved killing those enslaved Africans who it was felt were too affectionate to their white enslaver rapists. So as Dr. Maxwell said, Sally Bassett may not have intended to poison Nancy along with the Fosters, but it is, you know, it's up for, I suppose, debate and discussion, and perhaps we may never know for sure. Perhaps Dr. Maxwell is doing some research on that, if it in fact was the case. But I put that out to you because our ancestors, some 30 years later, 31 years later, made the decision in the planning stages of the conspiracy of 1761 to kill, you know, friendly Negroes. Right? We've had throughout our history, we've had dangerously friendly Negroes when it came to those who acted as axe handles supporting the discriminatory policies that were aimed at African people during the early and mid 20th century. People like I'm not gonna name and shame. I won't do that. I said I won't do that, so I'm not gonna do that. But there have been many Africans, many of whom joined the United Bermuda Party, a party which itself was created with the intention of enshrining in perpetuity white economic and political power here in Bermuda. It was born as a result of and in reaction to the formation of the Bermuda Progressive Labor Party, right? Again, a political organization which was attempting to give African people here in Bermuda a platform from which they can empower themselves and exact much greater positive results in their interests in the House of Assembly, right? Politically and ultimately economically as well. But there were many an axe handle sat across the floor from them, across the aisle. You know, I'm not going to name any of them, but suffice it to say, 2 black axe handles show up as national heroes, which I think is laughable, pathetic, and disgusting.
I just wanted to interject in there just a bit too. What's interesting about Sarah Sally Bassett's story again is that in actuality, she didn't do the poison.
Yeah.
Her granddaughter did the poison back.
Mm-hmm.
She instructed back on exactly what to do, and back did exactly what her grandmother instructed her to do. So it's quite interesting with that as well too, because in a lot of the historical sources, you don't really hear much of what happened to back afterwards, but we could imagine, because they knew that she was the one, and even her being coerced into, talking about her grandmother and stuff during the court case. So I always found that quite interesting, is that part of the case, it was a case in that she could have got off. Sarah Sally Bassett really could have got off because she didn't commit the crime. Mm-hmm. The one who actually committed the crime, the actual crime of the actual poisoning at the Foster's residence, was back, her granddaughter. Mm-hmm. So I just always find that interesting.
Absolutely. I had another question actually regarding some of the things you mentioned around axe handles, 20th century, 21st century. So what do you believe is the historical legacy of colonialism, Christianity, and the other supporting institutions and individuals around that in its role in sustaining enslavement of people? And do you feel that these systems are still entrenched in the world today?
That's a huge, huge question.
It's a deep one.
Take up another hour and a half, so I'll try to
piece by piece.
Yeah, chew this elephant. But I will say that we are still casting off the shackles of bondage, if you will. Economic bondage. We had the independence movements, right? And that was an incomplete success, I like to call it. Because even though we were able to claim independence over, the territories, can we claim economic autonomy even on the continent of Africa? Remembering that it was the Berlin Conference of 1884, 1885 that initially divided Africa, like one would cut up and divide up a pie, in the interests of European powers, who parasitically, in very extractive and violently extractive, for that matter, ways, mined Africa for all of her natural resources and were able to build up their economies, right? And this happened, again, over a long period of time. So as Africa was having its natural resources stripped from it, it was, as a result, not able to use those resources to enrich itself. And so what you see is the parasitic nations of Europe. And instead, you know, it's important, again, using, I think, more accurate terminology, they are parasitic nations. They are not developed nations. They're parasitic because the relationship was one of a parasite feeding off a host body, right? So I think parasitic rather than developed would be a more accurate description of the European nations who, again, fell upon and feasted on Africa like a pack of ravenous rabid hyenas. Right? So we had folk who were pushing back against that, people like Thomas Sankara in what is now known as Burkina Faso, down in South Africa of Chris Hani. There are folk who were implacable foes, Patrice Lumumba in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. We had folk who were implacable foes of modern day white supremacy and imperialism. And they fought the good fight, as did Maurice Bishop and the New Jewel movement in Grenada. You know, that was ultimately toppled by the imperial designs of the United States government. So we have all of these instances where we're pushing back. So as far as the legacy of colonialism and bondage, well, they're still feasting on Africa and African people for that matter. And they're still seeking to misrepresent and erase our history. And they're still seeking to absolve themselves from guilt, from culpability, and from connection to any number of the dysfunctions that we see besetting African communities worldwide. Right? You know, ghettos didn't spring fully formed out of, you know, the presence of melanated people gathering and concentrated in a space. Ghettos, very poor economic areas, socioeconomic areas, were the creation of capitalism, right? Economic maldistribution of resources based upon race. So we cannot separate race and capitalism. You know, they're in many respects co-emerging phenomena, right? Built upon our black backs. Author and scholar Eric Williams discusses that in his work, Capitalism and Slavery, right? As does Walter Rodney in How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. Underdeveloped it, right? Again, speaking to the parasitic relationship between Europe and Africa, and Europeans and African people, wherever we are in the diaspora or at home as well. So if Dr. Maxwell would like to weigh in, I'd love to hear what my learned brother has to say about that. But yeah, that's my thinking. Next time, Clarence, next time, definitely. I would definitely want to hear from you. Yeah.
Great. Thanks so much, man. I mean, really took it from beginning to end and referenced so many different spaces in which our brothers and sisters moved in so many different ways to liberate themselves. And yeah, it's phenomenal. So many figures we can draw in. Thank you. Last question that I have is, now that we're here, right, what can we learn from his story and her story? And what would you like people to be left with from this first virtual tour of Sally Bassett and vis-a-vis African spirituality in Bermuda?
Well, if you all take nothing else from this presentation, I want you to remember this and put this front and center. Without African women in the forefront, nothing will come of any of our efforts at liberation. Right? Because history has shown us when African women are in leadership, they get things done. You know, to bring it very close to home, the person whose brainchild this whole African dispersion tour program was a Black woman by the name of Rashida Garman.
Thanks, Charlotte.
She gave birth to this. You know? No, thank you. You know, she gave birth to this. She saw a necessity and she acted upon it. She got stuff done. No, none of this. She just got things done. Another example would be Melody Van Putten, you know, a person who taught me so much. I'm forever in her debt. She saw a need, she created a program. Not a whole lot of this. She got things done. Victoria Montu, you know, Tantoy, you know, in Saint-Domingue, she groomed a gentleman by the name of Jean-Jacques Dessalines and spoke into him prophecy, said, you will liberate this land. He was like, word, me? Yes, you. So she guided him in martial strategy and other things. And as a result of her enlightened leadership, things changed. Nana Ya Santewa called the men to order and told them, if you all ain't gonna do it, come on, bruh. No long talking. She kicked them in the butts. They got stuff done. When and Carlotta Lucumi, the 3 rebel queens, and you know, there's so many. And Buya Nahanda, Winnie Mandela, Dame Lois Brown Evans, Mary Prince, right? I could literally go on and on and on. But if we don't put them front and center in the telling of our stories, we are doing ourselves a colossal disservice, and it will forever be impossible to truly liberate ourselves, because we have to learn to look at the feminine principle of new eyes rather than blue eyes. And we have to learn to nurture and uplift the power of woman, the power of Black woman, the original woman, because from that, all blessings flow. And until we grasp that, until we can humble ourselves and divest ourselves of white patriarchal prejudices, right? Until we can get out of our own way and recognize the leadership of Black women, I don't see much positive things coming our way. We've yet to learn the lesson of it's not good to imitate your oppressors in your interactions with your sisters, mothers, wives, and lovers.
Yeah, that's awesome. Jalika, you should, I like that one you talk about with Oshun.
Oh, yeah. In the Odu, which is Odu Ifa, which is the orature of the Yoruba people, their spiritual corpus. There's a story in one of the Odu about Oshun. She was sent along with 15 other Orisha to Earth to, you know, do some work to get things popping. Well, the 15 male Orisha said, you know what? We don't need Olodumare. We don't need Oshun. You know, we don't need it. We got this. So taking umbrage to that, she was like, I'm bouncing. Peace out. Went up to the moon and was there powdering her nose. Now, let me just say this. We couch deep wisdom in stories, right? We couch deep wisdom in stories. So when you read Anansi stories, there are, you know, some fantastic elements, but the idea is that those fantastic elements constitute a feeder system. And what we are supposed to do is distill the wisdom found therein. So don't get caught in all the fantastic stuff about Oshun on the moon. Not the point. Well, she was on the moon, powdering her nose, just chilling, right? And the 15 male Orisha were just down there. The male divinities were trying to make things get on and pop in, but they were meeting with no success. So finally, frustrated, they returned to Olodumare and said, no, we're just not able to, you know, enact what you have asked us to do. So Olodumare asked the question, well, where is Oshun? And they said, well, you know, she bounced. Olodumare says, go get her. Oshun comes. And it is revealed that they were very disrespectful. And so she withdrew her services. And the lesson found therein is that in the absence of the feminine principle, in the absence of the power of the feminine principle, the counterbalancing effect of that, nothing good, nothing fruitful will be produced. Nothing. That's the message, that's the lesson that particular will do, right? When you turn your back on the divine feminine, nothing positive, nothing beneficial can ever be brought forth. Yeah? So our ancestors wrote this into the spiritual teachings in order to keep us in line with what we needed to be in line with. Right? That patriarchy is ultimately a poison that would destroy us all, and that African spirituality spoke against that. It was very clear that that needed to be cast aside, cast into the fire. And so if we want, as African people, to bring it here to 2020, if we want good things to happen to us, we must cleave to the leadership of African women. We must be respectful of their genius and their gifts and their creativity, because it's in mining that resource and putting ourselves in service of the enlightened leadership of powerful African women that good things, I believe, ultimately will come our way.
Yeah, I see Ajala just gave us brother some homework right here.
That's what our history says. If you ain't right with Black women, then you nothing.
It's absolutely true, man. It's absolutely true. I mean, I feel that yeah, it goes without saying. And that's an interesting segue into a question we have from an anonymous attendee. And I'll just paraphrase the question in general. They were saying, what can white Bermudians do in a matter of fact of addressing some of these historical legacies that you spoke to earlier? I guess for me to take that question, I think in a place like this is a good place to start. So many times we attempt to solutionize so many things when instead we should be sitting back and understanding the reality that we're in and how we arrived here. And there are so many keys that are stored within our past and within our heritage and shared history that we can look at and utilize and see how they can be implemented going forward. Just as you mentioned with men taking a reflexive approach and adhering to female leadership in the way that, you know, the Haitian revolutionary did and was given his instructions in a way that a person like a Dame Lewis Brown Evans did in Bermuda. So that's one small piece of it, starting places like this, continuing to learn and listen, most of all.
Yeah, I'd just like to piggyback on that question as well too. I work with also sometimes doing research work, especially when I'm doing work for Cedar Bridge, taking the children out on the African diaspora tours. And as you guys would know, some of those locations are owned by the Bermuda National Trust, which is known as a oligarchy of white men who kept a lot of that information. And so I do have to reach out to them. And it's been times where they've told me, as even some white folks that I've worked with, that Rashida is a very difficult subject for us to talk about. Many of them would say that because they, as even white Bermudians, they are still very much benefiting off of that legacy. And I had a conversation with them and I said, yeah, I understand that, but the story needs to be told. The whole story needs to be told. And I need you guys to understand that the whole story needs to be told to our children, to us, as many of us who don't even know what happened. We think that many of us were like, and not to be disrespectful, like many of us were like Johnny Bonds and everything's happy and it's okay, and it's not. We have, just to dive into that even furthermore, we have our sons killing each other. It's our sons, not your sons, our sons that are killing each other. They don't see the humanity in each other. Partly why our sons do not see the humanity in each other is because of slavery. Because they don't know any of these stories. They don't know the stories before slavery of their ancestors, and they don't know the stories of slavery that their ancestors endured. And with that, because they've been conditioned to go to school, we send them to school to think European, to think white, to act white, to be white. Therefore, they see each other as an enemy as opposed to a brother. And I've had these conversations with white folks and white Bermudians. And with that, they're like, most times they say, wow, that's profound. I said, yeah, this work is very important to me because even the other day, our sons are killing each other, and partly why they are murdering each other and laying out each other's blood is because they do not see the humanity in themselves, and they do not see the humanity in each other. So this is a very important work that we have to continue to do. And yeah, we may not reach all of them, but I'll tell you guys, when I take out these Cedar Bridge children, and Gina sees it too, our young sons, they get it, and they understand it, that these stories. And they're like, wow, you know, and then you have the other ones who's sometimes gotten in trouble and are too far going. And they have said, if I knew some of these stories, I would have not have committed some of the crimes that I did. And it's not an exaggeration, but it's just a true fact of the matter. So when people say, and another thing I get from the children is, Ms. Godwin, you know, sometimes they would tell me, I really enjoyed being with you. I enjoy learning about our Black Bermudian history and stuff like that. But what can I say to some of the people who may say, why are you talking about this? Why are you guys still harping on that? And I said, you tell them that they could go to the Jewish people and ask them why they still talking about the Holocaust. They could go to the, you know, I'm not being disrespectful, the Portuguese people. Every year in Bermuda, they do their parades and things that they do amongst themselves. And there's nothing wrong with that, but they are sharing their culture and their heritage. So it's time that us as Black people in Bermuda, which are really Africans in Bermuda, it's time that we start to research our own history and find out who we are before we got here. And especially now, so because like I said, our sons are killing each other. And none of us are far removed from that. None of us. So I just wanted to just add that to it.
Excellent point. And I think most important term from that is recognition of Africans in Bermuda. I think once you start there, the rest is just going to be beautiful, you know?
Can I jump in?
Go for it, man.
I'm not built for that sort of work. I'm not built to teach white supremacists, white people, about the nature of white supremacy. Not in a climate and a time where African people are literally dying, psychologically and physically. You know, we're losing our sons. Right? And part of that is due to the psychic injury, the historical residue that has drowned them. You know, we haven't taught them how to swim, how to navigate through that particular stream, how to get away from the quicksand, the quagmire in which how did they get to that point? Right? So I say all that to say, I don't have the psychic energy to offer white folk. You know, I don't have that lifeline to throw to them, to pull them out of the mess that they are in, because they have become collectively human trash. When your whole identity is built upon the negation of a human being, then you have become something yourself that is less than human. Right? That's the work that white folk must do for themselves. We, African people here in Bermuda and elsewhere around the world, have a cartload of things that we have to address. And it is to that I turn my attention, my complete and utter attention.
Okay. You have any more questions, Carlson? As we're coming up to the end to start to begin to wrap it up.
All right. Personal note, Ajala, where can we find the books that you have written on these topics?
Oh, again, I like writing for the kids. One of the books I've written is Dame Lewis, The People's Advocate. Again, available on Amazon. The second is Look for Me in the Whirlwind, The Story of Marcus Garvey. Again, available on Amazon. And they call them Rus, Paulu Kumar Kefego and the Making of a Bermudian Revolutionary. That's available on Amazon as well as at Rio Bermuda, which is owned by Nikisha and Ian Cameron, who are again doing the great work that has been handed to them from
True Reflections, through Nook and Nook by Rashina Beek, and now that baton has been taken up by the husband and wife duo, and they're doing great work curating our story and making it available even in these COVID-19 times. You shop, they will drop. So I gave a little ad for that. But yeah, my book is available there as well.
Okay, great. So, folks, we want to thank you for this evening. You guys are going to see a short survey come up on your screen in a minute, and we'd be glad if you'd be able to just complete that. And as we go to close out, Gina's going to close us out.
Well, good evening once again, and thank you very much for coming and participating in our very first virtual Sankofa journey. It's been a lot tonight. The do and its meaning, liberty and community, looking at the strength of women and the importance of the woman. Sarah Bassett and her journey and survival and the implications of chattel slavery. We've learned a lot tonight. And in that learning, we hope that you've enjoyed this presentation, and we are certainly glad that you have actually taken the time to come and spend it with us this evening. We'd like to thank Titan Tours for sponsorship, and we truly hope that you enjoyed this presentation. Feel free to visit our website at sankofabermuda.com or like our Sankofa Journey Bermuda Facebook and Instagram pages. Look out for our next presentation on Zoom, which will take place in the near future. And as we depart, here are some very last words for tonight. In everlasting memory of the anguish of our ancestors, may those who died rest in peace. May those who return find their roots, and may humanity never again perpetuate such injustice against humanity. And we, the living, vow to uphold this: never again, never again, never again. Thank you very much for attending. Fill out the survey, and please look for us the next time Sankofa has a presentation.
Great. So we'd like to thank you guys again. We're just going to stay on a little bit longer if anybody wants to stay on, but we're pretty much at the end of the presentation, and we'll just stay on for discussion if anybody wants to continue to join us in some further discussion for just a few more extra minutes.
Can I just share something? The importance of storytelling. Our ancestors saw it as incredibly important to keep and maintain the memory of a people. In fact, the term Jali from the Bambara peoples refers to the blood, right? Literally translated to mean the blood. The French, when they came over, identified these folk as storytellers, and they called them griot, G-R-I-O-T. But it was far more than that. They were keepers of the memory of a people, and they saw it as the lifeblood of a people. So that when the danger comes when you forget your stories, when you lose your memory, right? When you lose your memory, it's as if the body has been emptied of its blood, and a body emptied of blood is sure to perish. So when we forget, when we lose our memories, then terrible things befall us. It's inevitable, right? So that's why it's key and important that we engage in the politics and practice of Sankofa, going back and fetching, going back and reclaiming our memory, going back and correctly and accurately representing our story. Because it's not merely the sterile recitation of fact, it is the healing, it's the reinvestment of memory, it's the reintegration of the lifeblood of a people, right? So what we're engaging in, to be quite frank, is the resurrection
of an African people who have for too long been violently divested of their memory. So that's why Clarence Maxwell's work is so critical. That's why Keto Swan's work is incredibly important. That's why Eileen Nellie Musson and Cyril Outteridge Packwood should be hailed as luminaries and really pioneers in reclaiming our memories. People like from Monk to Mazumbo author, Ira Phillip, you know, basically chronicled the 20th century history of Bermuda, of Black Bermuda. The work of A.B. Place and others with the Bermuda Recorder was reclamation of memory, reinvesting into a people the lifeblood, so that we could rise from the ashes, not unlike the Bermudiana flower that rose from the ashes of our martyred revolutionary, Sarah Sally Bassett.
Exactly. And like you said, these stories, like what you say, even for us not to know these stories, was it very intentional, deliberate, or was it accidental?
It was deliberate, 100% deliberate, 100% deliberate. You know?
I even look at when I look at a lot of the stuff in the school system, and even when I reflect on when I went to high school, history was always European. And even today, history, there's very little that you learn about Black history like what we learn when we do this Sankofa information. So that's important, and that even helps young persons when the more you know about where you come from, the better equipped you are to survive and to do that which makes you who you need to be. The less likely you are to do negative things because you understand. But I just find that that's something that isn't taught. You know, the first time I ever heard Mary Prince, I was a grown woman. And so because it wasn't something that was taught in school, so I think that's part of the disaster, I guess, for want of a better word. I don't know how I would describe that.
Yeah, exactly. Well, it's in, like Ajala said, it's been intentional and deliberate, but again, it's something that we have to take the reins for ourselves and say that these are our children. I can't, it's been a while, you know, I could never, even though I have one son, I can never say, oh, that young man over there, he's into something and, you know, he got murdered. So it's nothing to do with me. I cannot take that stance because at the end of the day, these things will come to all of our doors. Hence they have in Bermuda. You know, well, many of us are not very far removed from a lot of the murders and shootings that happened here, and still happening. And again, like I say, I liken it to that. And I know that, I don't even liken it. I've spoken to some of these young men and I know they don't, and I've said that to some of them. I say, and that's why I always find so profound. I've said to them, wow, you know, I was, you know, you would know some. I would say, oh, why did that happen? And they'll explain and they'll be like, because, you know, I'm done, mom, you know, and I'm like, I said, oh my God, why are you so angry? And you just don't or refuse to see the humanity in that other person who's really your brother. It's not my brother.
And it crosses every spectrum. I mean, even because young people that perpetuate negativity against each other grow up to be adults to do the same thing. And so that's why even like when you look at Black on Black businesses, and there's always that backstabbing type thing a lot of times that goes on, or people just doing dishonest things to other individuals because of that, because again, it's like a lack of humanity. They just don't care. They just look out for themselves. And it's not, what is it that we were sent to that? Ubuntu? Ubuntu. We don't have that.
I am because we are.
Right, we don't have that. It's always me, whatever I can get for myself. And so somewhere along the line, we definitely have to get to where we are a unit that support each other and that comes with understanding and education of who we are.
Exactly. And especially nowadays, I feel that there is absolutely no excuse. We sit in a lot of the positions of power on this island. Yes, we may not be the governor. And I'll tell you, the governor has been on our tours. He thoroughly enjoyed Mary Prince, but we are put in positions where we could really do some things. But like Ajala said earlier, we have to do it, not talk it. We actually have to do it.
And again, the people, and this is the importance, this is also the distinction between education and training. So training looks like a seal that has learned to balance a ball on the tip of its snout and swim in figure 8, right? And you say, wow, that's a well-trained seal. But in fact, that seal is operating outside of its mind. It's not in its right mind. It's been trained out of its mind because that's not normal seal behavior, right? So when we see Africans, people who have been nurtured in anti-Black educational systems, like from primary school straight through to high school and beyond into tertiary education, where their orientation, their educational orientation is 100% Eurocentric, which means, of necessity, it's also fundamentally anti-Black. Then what you have is, like the SEAL example that I gave earlier, African people who are operating out of their African minds, right? And so you become axe handles because your education is there only to produce, to create intellectual units who have lost the capacity to reproduce ideas of their own making, which are in their own racial interests, right? So we have to, although we Black people are in positions of power, quote unquote, we aren't the recipients of an empowered education system. We are the recipients of training. And our training makes us do figure 8s with beach balls affixed to our snouts. That's what we're looking at. So we need a lot of things. Maybe that's going to be hopefully, fodder for other conversations. But it's a lot to ask leadership that has been steeped in Eurocentricity to somehow develop the vision to see what African people need when their training has told them that African people don't even exist. And that they, in fact, are not even African. They're something else. Black Bermudian, for example.
Good point. Very good point.
And part of that is still to date, we are not really and truly seen as people unless we kowtow to what the others want, if you understand what I'm saying.
Yeah.
Yes, our points are valueless, our contributions are valueless, even our businesses are valueless, and they are not of value at all unless nobody knows that it's ours.
Yeah, it's very much, I would call that part of the residue. We have like a lot of residue from slavery. And again, it goes right back to Sarah Sally Bassett's sculpture, the statue. It was supposed to be up City Hall. Why? Because it didn't look right. Or some other folks say it didn't look white enough.
And we're afraid. We are afraid. Yeah, it's like
we can't have her up here.
Yeah.
Because little Sue or little Tom will probably say, "What is that statue, Mommy? Why does it look like that? Yeah. Especially, why does it have fire going around it? That is scary. That is crazy." And some will have to explain to their children what her statue actually represents.
Yeah.
But again, until we do these things, until we have these conversations, we will continue to be victimized by propaganda masquerading as history, right? Because ultimately, history is both map and mirror. It's supposed to guide us. We're supposed to see ourselves writ large in the yellow papyrus of our ancestral stories. And then we are supposed to use it to navigate the topography of the present day. But until we do the work, Sankofa, to bring it back where we began, until we go back and fetch it, and that's an act of courage, right? And that's an act of rebelling against our conditioning, right? Because again, we've been conditioned, we've been trained out of our African minds. What we're asking ourselves to do is to rebel against that, to fight against the tide of the overwhelming tide of whiteness that is threatening to swallow us up in this whirlpool and drown us, right? Battling against all that and going back to our past and getting the necessary stories that we need to infuse ourselves, to empower ourselves so that we can start making changes in the present day, right? History is a tool, right? History is a tool. I think Malcolm X was the one who said, of all our studies, all our subjects, history is the subject best able to reward our efforts. He said something to that effect. Right? That is the ultimate value of the study of our past, so that we can have tools to move us forward into the present and ultimately into a better, brighter, a more empowered and African-centered future.
Exactly, Sankofa. And it's so important because, especially history, you know, like many other things, and it saddens me. We do so many things that don't serve us. It does absolutely nothing to serve us, but you can view history and look at a lot of this history, and you can take a lot of that and compile it and say, wow, because even through that history, a lot of the slavery history and before slavery history and Black history, there were always some black folks who, like you said, got on with it, and they were able to put themselves in a great economic position amongst all that was going on. And I always find these ones pretty fascinating. And yes, it's just like some of these stories, you know.
Oh, we make here in Bermuda, we make heroes of axe handles. You know, that's what John Swan is. That's what E.T. Richards is. Right? We make heroes out of axe handles. And so we have children who, in looking at the people we have, you know, lionized, without giving the context, you know, without giving the history of why they were chosen to be lionized, you know, what we see is a cookie cutter Black success without context. So our children can't understand why, for example, you could have both Jack Tucker and Paulu Camargo nominated for the Bermuda to be Bermuda National Heroes. What? In what world could those two gentlemen share the same space as heroes? One was an ardent, one of the principal architects for modern day white supremacy. And the other, Paulu, was an implacable foe fighting against and seeking the wholesale eradication of the structures that created white supremacist domination here in Bermuda. Right? But yet both of them are nominated as national heroes? How, Sway? Right? But these are the things that we, in the absence of a curriculum that is sufficiently engaged in deep inquiry into the story of Bermuda's past, doesn't arm our students with the ability to start challenging these BS moments. Right? Jack Tucker and Paul, national heroes, where they do that at? So, a lot to be done.
Yeah, we don't know the history, and that's why even we'll be coming back again for emancipation, and that's a great thing we could talk about even is the coming together of the Friendly Society folks, and their stories are pretty awesome. It's said that a lot of that them as well too. There's many things that they put together for Africans in Bermuda, and they but unfortunately laws were passed and you can see how the laws were passed eventually. And then they of course, a lot of that just the Friendly Society, their institution, started to diminish, even though it was an institution that was supposed to be, that was for empowerment, economic empowerment, social empowerment, all sorts of empowerment for Black Bermudians. But once you could see that, you could definitely see when you read the history in the oligarchy, they said it was just too much of a good thing happening for Black folk. It really was. And then you saw laws coming into place to change a lot of these things, and hence they're part of why they're not as strong as they are in the community today. But we don't know the history. And then people confuse their history. Lots of times their history is another narrative, false narrative out there that's darkened them to be viewed as I forget that other organization, what they call it, the Masons and stuff. You know what I mean? There's a lot of confusion amongst that, and people say they do all sorts of things. But if you do a deep dive into the Friendly Society history, that's one of the best things that's happened here within the community. But yeah. Yeah, all right. So I guess we'll just start to definitely wrap it up, guys.
Okay.
For this evening. It was great. We had a great amount of folks coming on. I think we had about 40-something people. So that was
41,
great.
yeah. Not including us, I think. All right. So, well, have a great night on. Please tell your friends about us. Tell us how great and fantastic we were. And if you had nothing positive to say, you were not on this site.
Yeah, and happy Mother's Day again to everybody. Even if you didn't have children, you are a mother. Everybody has mothered some child in some point in their life, and enjoy the day.
Even if you are a man who's mothered a child. I don't know if that's possible. But
yes, I guess, yeah.
Yes, who knows?
All right. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks. Good evening.
Have a great night.
Night.
Good night.
Ashe.
Everybody, ashe, ashe. Thank you.
Our ancestors voyaged through death to life on these shores. We are here because of them. Mojuba, I give praise to Olodumare, the queen whose mat spreads across the universe. I give praise to the sunset and the sunrise. I give praise to the Egun, the ancestors, both known and unknown. I give praise to the Orisha, the manifestations of Olodumare, the supreme being, who are made manifest in the natural order and the natural world, and who are found within each and every human being. King Kamashe, let no negativity befall those of you who are watching this broadcast. May there be no fighting in your families. May there be no death in your families in this time of COVID-19. May there be no sickness in your families. Grant us long life. Grant us overall health and peace. Ashe, Ashe, Asheo, Ashe, Yoruba word meaning, may it be so.